Good evening, everybody, and welcome into tonight's program with the Schaumburg Library. My name is Chris. I'm your adult program coordinator at the library, and I'm so happy to be with you this evening and with our guest from out of state who drove all the way to Zoom just to be here with us tonight. As we acknowledge and honor that this November is actually the 60th anniversary since the assassination of President Kennedy. Now I wanted to take, when I initially inquired with our speaker, Wendy, I wanted to take a different approach to acknowledging this national tragedy and remembering President Kennedy, and actually talking more about not just his legacy, but his family's legacy. And so that's kind of what we're going to cover this evening. Now, of course, I am not an expert on the Kennedys, so I'm not going to go too deep right now. But before I introduce our speaker, who's going to take over from here, just a few friendly Zoom reminders. Your cameras and microphones are turned off. So if you're experiencing any technical difficulties during tonight's program, please make sure to throw those in the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. That's the best way for me to get in contact with you and go back and forth. If you use the chat function, which is open for patrons, if you want to talk to each other during the presentation, I might lose your question in back and forth between patrons. So make sure you're putting those there. Same thing with any questions you might have for today's presenter. We'll address all questions at the end of today's presentation, but if you have any as the presentation goes along, make sure to throw those in the Q&A, and we'll address those with Wendy at the end of the program. Make sure you're dropping them as you go, because we don't want to forget any and then be at the end and go, what was that question I wanted to ask her 15 minutes in? So that way we'll be all good to go. We also have closed captions enabled, and you can turn those on or off as you wish using your Zoom toolbar. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker. Wendy Northcross retired in 2021 after a 33-year career in Chamber of Commerce leadership. I just lost my place. Soon after retirement, she was tapped as the executive director of the John F. Kennedy Hyannis Museum, an organization she co-funded in 1992, while at the Hyannis Chamber of Commerce. In her third act, Northcross maintains an active volunteer schedule, serving on several boards, including that of a regional bank and local nonprofits dedicated to keeping Cape Cod a great place to live and work. She lives in West Barnstable with her husband, Van, and loves to travel, especially to sites related to U.S. presidents. Everyone give a big virtual welcome to Wendy Northcross.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everyone. Nice to be with you all from beautiful Cape Cod. I am going to give you what I call the backstage tour to our primary exhibit. It's one that we mounted and opened last year in 2022, which happened to be the 30th anniversary of the founding of the JFK Hyannis Museum. It's right in downtown Hyannis. We're about 2 miles from the Kennedy compound. But really, the museum was a response to intense curiosity of visitors from all over the world who, even today, 60 years after the end of the Kennedy administration, 60 years later, people still come to Cape Cod to learn something about the family, to see and experience the Cape that the president loves so much. So, and the homes, the Kennedy compound is still occupied. The houses are not open for touring. And so there was a lot of curiosity that we had to try to funnel into someplace and give people stories in the background. We're not the presidential library. We work very closely with the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston. But we tell the Cape Cod story. So here's the backstage tour, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the end. This exhibit that I'm going to show you pieces of is largely comprised of photography and video, but that's no accident because President Kennedy was the most photographed president at that time. Plus his father, Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy, he was an amazing businessman. He was a very crafty, astute marketer. He knew how to sell product. He knew how to sell politicians. And so he knew photography was a big piece of that. So we have benefited greatly from that. So as we move through our story, and hopefully this doesn't go too fast, this is the first thing that we try to tell people who are not from Cape Cod, that Hyannis Port, which was known as the location of the summer White House, is just a neighborhood in a town called Barnstable. We are one of the oldest places in the country. The Pilgrims landed on Cape Cod first over 400 years ago. And so our towns have these very old English names primarily, or they're taken from the Native American population. But Hyannis Port is just a neighborhood. And if you were to, I'm going to get my little laser pointer here. If you were to follow this beach, this was a picture taken last year in Hyannis Port. If you were to follow this beach around, right behind this blue banner, you would see a cluster of small white houses really close together. And in the middle of that is what's known as the Kennedy compound. But it's not a walled off mansion area. These are just beautiful vernacular New England homes, seacoast homes. They're very nice homes, and they're right on the water, which is beautiful, but they're nothing elaborate, I guess is a good way to say it. And Hyannis Port, once we tell people it's just a neighborhood, it's not an incorporated city or town, we try to tell people how the Kennedys came to even be on Cape Cod. And it's rather interesting. Joseph Kennedy, as I said, Ambassador Joe Kennedy, by the age of 38, he was worth $2 million. I should ask you how much that is worth today. I'll tell you it's over $31 million today. He was the youngest bank president when he was 25 years old. He was a financier who invested not only in the stock market and in Hollywood not producing, but distributing Hollywood movies. He, during Prohibition, knew that it would end at some point. He had strong ties with Ireland. He secured the distribution rights, the sole distribution rights for Haig and Haig and Dewar Scotch, so that when Prohibition was over, all of that liquor started flowing into his warehouses here in America. So he was really good at making a lot of money. But he was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, as was his wife, Rose. They were starting to have a big family. And like any family of means that lives in a city, come summertime, you try to get out of the city, especially pre-air conditioning. So they went on the hunt for a summer house that they could rent. They looked at the seacoast of New Hampshire and stayed there for a couple of years. They found a nice spot in Cohasset, Massachusetts, which is just south of Boston. Joe really liked it, and he tried to join the golf club there, and they never acted on his application. He wasn't necessarily blackballed, they just tabled his application. And they never really told him why. And I'm going to ask you if you know why they tabled his application. He had 4 strikes against him. He was a Democrat. He was Irish. He was Catholic. And he was new money. He didn't come from generations of Boston Brahmin money. So they really didn't want his kind in Cohasset. He looked at Rose. He said, come on, we're going to keep looking for a summer place. They thought about Newport, Rhode Island, but there were a lot of uber wealthy people that were migrating to Newport, Rhode Island. And they decided to try Cape Cod. Now, this is in the 1920s. This is 1926. And Cape Cod was just a backwater. I mean, we really didn't have a lot here, but his dad had brought him here when he was a kid. But Cape Cod had some things going for it. We had railroad access. We had beautiful sandy beaches. We had a Catholic church. We had a golf club that would accept his application. And we had a yacht club that could teach his kids how to sail, because that's something Ambassador Joe Kennedy never had the opportunity to do, and he wanted his children to learn how to sail. And there were no Boston Brahmins looking down their noses at him. So they rented what is known as the Malcolm Cottage for a few years with their growing family. And I love to have some fun with this too. So this is the growing family, the Kennedy kids. Rose Kennedy, fortunately, always lined them up in birth order. And she dressed the boys and the girls in the same clothing so she could find them easily on the beach. But I'm sure you know some of the siblings from President Kennedy's history, but I'm just going to go through it rather quickly. The oldest son was Joseph Jr. He was the apple of his father's eye, and he was the intended recipient of his father's desire to have a president in the family, have a high-ranking politician. Jack was the second born child. And, you look at him, the charisma at this age, looking right at the camera, big smile. He was a real people person. He was always getting in trouble because his brother was always like the good one, and Jack was sort of the renegade. But he was a real people person. The oldest sister is Rosemary. Now, Rosemary had a very difficult entry into the world. Her mom had a difficult birth. The theory is that she lost some oxygen during that birthing process. And so she always had developmental delays and issues. At one point, her father tried an experimental surgery thinking that would help, and it was a lobotomy that really did not help. She never spoke again after that. She lived a long time. She's been in our museum, but just kind of a sad bit of story for the Kennedys. Then the next sister, this is Kathleen. Her nickname was Kick. Kick and Jack were best friends. They were about 3 years apart. They were same personality, outgoing, fun-loving. She just was a magnet for people. Kick married a man in England. She fell in love while her dad was ambassador to the court of St. James. That man was killed in World War II, as was her older brother, Joe Jr., was killed in a very dangerous bombing mission in World War II. But she stayed in England, and she had a boyfriend that was flying her to France to meet up with her father. They were both killed tragically in an airplane accident during bad weather. She was only 28 years old. Jack was inconsolable. He had basically lost his best friend. If you look at the family tree now, there's a lot of the siblings and their kids have named their children for Kathleen. This sister, this is Eunice Kennedy Shriver. They used to call her Puny Uni because she was always skinny as a rail, and she had Addison's disease just as her brother Jack did. But Eunice became her sister Rosemary's great champion. Eunice eventually went on to farm Special Olympics. And if it was another day and age, she was very bright. She was extremely competitive. She would have run for president if it had been acceptable for women to do that. This sister here, this is Patricia Kennedy Lawford. She married the actor Peter Lawford. She spent a lot of time on the campaign trail for her brother Jack. She lived in California a lot, but she was very, very great at campaigning and getting the Hollywood crew to support her brother for president. Now, this little guy, this is Bobby. So can you imagine? This is RFK. He ran his brother's national campaign for president. It's kind of hard to think of that when you see him at this age. And the baby, and I love to ask people when they're actually in the museum, who do you think this baby is? And a lot of them say Ted Kennedy. We'll say, no, Ted's not even born yet. This is baby Jean Kennedy Smith. She actually served as an ambassador to Ireland in the Clinton administration. Ted was born shortly thereafter, but you can see big family, big house. They rented this part of the Malcolm Cottage, right overlooking the Hyannis waterfront for 2 or 3 years. Rose Kennedy then said, this place will work. This is nice. And Joe bought the house. It was just these 2 gables, but had this big, wide porch, beautiful rolling lawns. They had a tennis court. They had a nice view and a private beach of Nantucket Sound. And nearby was a breakwater and a pier for sailing. The ambassador immediately enlarged the size of the house once they purchased it in 1928. He increased it to 15 bedrooms and 9 baths. I always figured there was a bathroom for each kid. So this house really became the heart and home for the Kennedy family. It was interesting because by this time, Ambassador Joe Kennedy is distributing the Hollywood films. He's got a lot of ties with Hollywood. He put a full RCA sound theater in the basement of the house, and all the kids became very popular because they could invite friends over to watch first-run Hollywood movies. But the kids also would come home. This is where they would come home from boarding school. They spent their holidays here, but they never had an assigned bedroom. They had to check the little chalkboard that was on each bedroom door for their name to see on that particular trip home which bedroom they had been assigned to. But this really became the backdrop too for Ambassador Kennedy and for Rose Kennedy to raise their kids as they did, to be very tight and dependent on each other. They said you can always depend on family. They also raised them to be extremely competitive. Joe Kennedy's mantra was win, win, win at all costs. I don't care if you're a boy or a girl, there's no room in this house for second place. And that applied to school, that applied to sports, that applied to daily life in the household. Mama Rose, she was the one that was making them do their social studies. And even if it was summertime, you have had to kept up with the current events because it's summer. At supper time, you were going to get grilled on what was going on in the world. And this house actually became the primary residence for Ambassador Joe Kennedy and Rose Kennedy after he left the ambassadorship and he moved full-time into the house. It's also where they both died. Rose Kennedy died at 104. The ambassador died in 1969 after a serious stroke. And Senator Ted Kennedy inherited this house, and he actually died there too in 2009. So we like to tell some fun stories too, important stories that happened in the family's life, but that happened here on Cape Cod. And one of them is the engagement of Jack and Jackie. So it's one of those events that there's a lot of fun stories behind it, but basically Jack's father said, okay, Jack, you're 34 years old. You want to be president someday. After the death of his older brother, Jack had picked up the mantle of the desire of his dad to have a president in the family, ran for Congress, and then he ran for Senate, and he was a junior senator from Massachusetts. But his dad said, you're kind of on your way, but you're 34 years old. You're not married. Things would go a lot better if you had a wife. And Jack didn't argue, but he did say, okay, Dad, I met this woman 2 years ago and she was nice, but she was engaged to somebody else. He touched base with her again, Jacqueline Bouvier, and found out that she had broken up her engagement with John Husted. So he proposed, and he did it on a transatlantic call. She was in London covering the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. But to his, to his great credit, he met her at the airport at Boston Logan Airport when she came back from covering that. She was a photographer for a Washington newspaper, and they came back to Cape Cod and they had an engagement party. There was an engagement party in Newport, Rhode Island, too, where her family had a house. And that was very genteel and sophisticated and lovely, as you can imagine, something that the Bouviers might do. And there was a party here at the Kennedy compound in June of 1953. And went on all weekend. And finally, the siblings said, let's have a scavenger hunt. It was something to do. So Rose Kennedy made up the list of all the things for the siblings to go out and find in teams, bring back to the compound the list of things. And on the list was the longest thing you could find. So Patricia Kennedy, a little quiet Patricia Kennedy there, she came into downtown Hyannis. She found a school bus that still had the keys in it. It was empty. She started up the bus, drove it to the compound, and she won the prize at the engagement party in that June of 1953. One thing that was really interesting, though, about the engagement is that engagement announcement made it into all of the biggest newspapers and magazines of the time, because Ambassador Joe Kennedy was so well connected and he was grooming his son. He was socializing his son for a national campaign. And here is this young junior senator from Massachusetts on the cover of Life magazine, which would be the Facebook of today. The wedding was not on Cape Cod. We do like to set that straight. They got married in September of 1953. So it would have been 70 years ago this past September. It was a beautiful wedding in Newport, Rhode Island. And they had the reception at Hammersmith Farm, which was Jackie's stepfather's home that he was raised in. And the announcement in the Boston Globe quoted Jackie's mom as saying, oh, we're just going to have a nice small wedding for just close family. Well, I think they had 600 people at the church and over 1,000 people at the reception. And Ambassador Joe Kennedy paid for the whole thing. So again, he was working the crowd and making sure that his son was well known and well liked. I heard that it took them 2 hours to shake hands at the wedding reception. There were so many people there. So it was by 1960, that's when Jack Kennedy decided it was time to pursue the presidency. He'd been elected to Congress in 47. He served 3 terms, and in 1952, he ran for U.S. Senate and won. They got married in 53, so it's 1960. He figured it's time to go for the top job. He, in fact, was the youngest person to ever be elected president, and it was a very rigorous campaign run by his brother Bobby. This photograph here in our exhibit shows, it's a little hard to see. You have to come to Hyannis and see the whole exhibit. But this was taken in Bobby Kennedy's house, where Jack and Jackie had been on the campaign trail. They flew into Boston, they voted where they were registered to vote, and they came to Hyannis to wait for the election returns. The people that were involved in the campaign, the advisors and the family, were all clustered at Bob Kennedy's house, waiting for the phone banks to ring, and people around the country were calling in the results. And it was a very, very close race. It was going into the late night. Bob was getting upset that Nixon wouldn't concede. His brother Jack said, "Why should he? It's a close race. I wouldn't." And Jack went to bed. And it wasn't until the next morning when Caroline Kennedy was sent in by her nanny, sent in to wake up her dad, and she said, "Good morning, Mr. President." And that's how he found out the outcome of the election. So the family had been walking the beach or scattered around, probably taking a shower and having some breakfast. And the photographer that Ambassador Joe Kennedy had hired tried to gather the family for a family photo at the compound, which he did. And it was one of the few photos with the siblings at that time, after they had lost some to tragedy, that they had a family photo. And then they all got in a caravan of cars and they came to downtown Hyannis, in a building that's right behind our museum building. And they walked in to meet the world press that had been gathering for days and their campaign workers in our armory building. Now it's November and it's Cape Cod. And right now it's 60 years later, Cape Cod gets a little quiet in the off season, especially in November, December. But the crowds were packed. There were so many people. People were taking their kids out of school to come to Hyannis to get a glimpse of the president-elect. And something very unusual happened. This is a photo that was recently given to us by a local nun, actually. And this is a picture that someone was standing on the building roof. And you can see the president here. You can see very pregnant Jackie Kennedy and the ambassador and Rose Kennedy. And as they walked into the armory building, a very unusual thing happened. The media gave them a standing ovation. Now, they don't do that today. It's really not done. It was very rare that that would happen then. I'm thinking maybe they were just so glad it was finally decided and they could go take a shower and get a cup of chowder. But from the reports that we've read, people were truly, truly excited. This was a new generation. Somebody born in this century, well, this past century, had served in World War II and had just had given some inspiration and hope to this younger generation, and that was being very much embraced. So Nixon finally did concede, and the vote was very, very close. It was just over 112,000 votes, the popular vote that brought Kennedy into the White House. Of course, he did get the electoral college vote by a little bit bigger spread, but it was a very, very tight race. This is today what the outside of that armory building looks like. We have a Kennedy legacy trail that will take you to spots and sites related to the Kennedy presidency, pretty much, and sites that you can do in a self-guided tour. It was very interesting because at that point, our town fathers our town select board had said, well, thank goodness that election is over, because it was pretty hectic. I mean, there were media from all over the world. There were campaign workers coming and going for well over a year. And it was really kind of a beehive of activity here. But our select board said, well, thank goodness that's done. We can go back to normal. And that never happened. Well, I have to tell you that we know from the presidential diaries that every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, especially in June, July, and August, President Kennedy would come home to Hyannis Port. Now it's become a summer White House. That's why people think it was a summer home. But he's coming home every weekend, and he didn't come home to work. He really came home to be with family and to get away and to recharge. So I love this picture here. This is Pierre Salinger watching his boss play golf. The president was an excellent golfer, but he really didn't like people to know about that because he was very critical of how much time Eisenhower spent golfing. But the Air Force One would fly into our it's now called Joint Base Cape Cod. It was Otis Air Force Base at the time. He would fly into the Upper Cape on the upper shoulder of Cape Cod, and then take the helicopter from the Air Force Base and land on his father's front yard. Now, remember, it's this very tight, compact neighborhood, small houses, been here for a long time. To say it was disruptive of the neighborhood is a little bit of an understatement. But he would come out of the helicopter. First thing he would do is run into the house. This is the big house here. Change his clothes, load all the kids up, all the cousins that were gathered from his siblings in their various houses in the neighborhood, put them in the Tunerville trolley golf cart. He would race around the circle of the driveway, down the street and over to the candy store. He'd load them up with penny candy, and he'd come back, and they would just have a grand old time, either sailing or swimming or horseback riding, playing touch football, playing tennis, whatever it was. It was usually very physical games involved when the Kennedys were around. This house here that you're looking at is Bobby Kennedy's house, and Ethel Kennedy still lives there. She's in her mid-90s now. She's got quite a big family, and right behind this house would have been the president's house. So those three houses, president's house, Bobby and Ethel's house, and the big house of Joe and Rose, those three houses together were dubbed by the media the Kennedy compound. Kind of like that name, it kind of stuck. But today there's over 11 houses in the neighborhood that have owned by the Shrivers or the Kennedys or the Smiths. So it's been a family tradition, and we're going on almost 100 years of the family living in our neighborhood. Those presidential weekends were pretty wild. It was very soon that we had the largest police force in the southern part of New England, and just trying to keep the crowds at bay, if nothing else. Jack and Jackie would go to church up the street from us, 2 blocks away from our museum is. It's the St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church. This church is where Rose Kennedy attended church every single day. It's also on our Kennedy Legacy Trail for that self-guided tour. And it was all kinds of tricks that the Secret Service would play about which door to bring the president in for church on Sundays. But it wasn't all play. There was some work too. And the neighborhood got the pattern. They would say, oh, it's Friday at 5 o'clock. The president should be coming home. I wonder who he's bringing with him. So from time to time, he would bring dignitaries, mostly to make them understand Cape Cod and him and his family. But he did have to do some work from time to time. This is a picture. I love this picture. This is the inside of Jack and Jackie's house. So you can see through the window how close these houses are. I mean, can you imagine landing a helicopter in the middle of all this? But this picture here is significant for a couple of reasons. It has the decorator, Bob Luddington. He was the head decorator for Jordan Marsh Department Store in Boston. He had been hired by Rose Kennedy to do her homes. And so Jackie hired him, Ethel Kennedy hired him. I think Pat Lawford hired him. But this is all fabrics and decor chosen by Bob Luddington. He's given us his whole catalog of materials. He recently passed away, really, really wonderful man. But in this house too are some iconic Kennedy things. Here's one of his rocking chairs. So the president had a terribly bad back, and this rocking chair style gave him great comfort. So he had these everywhere. He had 14 rocking chairs. This is one of them. We have one that he gave to the Waldorf Astoria in the presidential suite. When he would stay there, he had a rocking chair there. They're going through a major renovation, so we're keeping it safe while they're doing that. But here's a rocking chair, and this is a Nantucket basket. If you've ever been to the Cape and Islands, you'd know about Nantucket lightship baskets. They're very collectible, very much in vogue still. But who they're talking to is fascinating. This is the interpreter for the president, and this is the interpreter for the son-in-law of Nikita Khrushchev, who was, let's see, Mr. Adzubey, and he was a journalist with a Russian newspaper. So he's doing this interview in his house with Russian journalists. However, the thing the president loved to do the most was sail. This is his boat was the Victoria. He named it when he got the boat given to him by his parents when he was 15 years old. He was an avid sailor, as was his brother Joe Jr. And when President Kennedy and Joe Jr. were in Harvard, they were in the yachting club, and they won medals for Harvard. They really loved these boats, and the family had several of these. They're called a Wiano Senior, and they're a one design boat, beautiful wooden boats with very low draft so that it can navigate our shallow waters. And one design means that all the boats are the same. There's a big fleet. Well, there's about 70 boats in the fleet now. So when you race in a one design race, all the boats are equalized. So if you win, it's because you're a good skipper. And in fact, President Kennedy was a very good skipper. He loved to sail. And we've heard that he wouldn't even go on vacation unless it was on a huge lake or, of course, the ocean. Now, I tell people this is not a sailboat race. That is a family outing. There's way too many people in that boat to win a race. The boat actually is still in existence. President Kennedy sailed that boat for 31 years, and his family continued to sail it after he was gone. They have other boats, and they have a fiberglass version of this boat now, the same name, but the actual boat lives at the Presidential Library in Boston. It comes back home to Cape Cod in the winter to be cared for. We like to tell people a little bit about Jackie too, because she left quite a legacy in her own right. She was 31 when she became First Lady. She had fascinating education. JFK was really taken with her and her intelligence, how well read she was, and they had both had shared a love of poetry. JFK's lifelong friend Lem Billings even said that he knew all of JFK's girlfriends, and there were a lot of them, but she was different. She was more literary, she was more substantial, and they really had an amazing partnership. Well, she had been to the White House for the first time when she was 11, and she thought it was rather shabby. Of course, she had been to royal palaces in Europe, and she just, I think when she was walking the beach after that long night of waiting for election returns, realizing she's going to live at the White House. I think right then and there, she cooked up the plan to undertake a major restoration. Because when she had first visited it, she was surprised there were no presidential antiques, there was no fine American art, and she thought, this is not right. This needs to be, the people's house needs to be the finest that it can be. So she helped establish the White House Historical Association, which was formed to raise the money. She worked with Henry DuPont to locate the presidential antiques. She procured the fine art. The White House became an amazing museum with its own curator. And then she said, as we're giving people tours, they need to have a guidebook to understand what's in the White House, what the significance of these things are. President's advisors said, oh, that's a bad idea. We don't do that. But she persisted. She had a friend write the book, the guidebook. She edited the guidebook. And last year in 2022, on her birthday, July 28th, 2022, the White House Historical Association released the 60th edition of the White House Guide. It has been continuously published for 60 years. White House Historical Association has also written a book on how she did it. Quite the politician in her own right. She is quite persuasive, and she worked very carefully behind the scenes and pulling the right people in to get this immense amount of work. So it's a great read, beautiful pictures of the end product. And of course, the historic White House Guide, they have a special hardbound copy if you're a collector of those kinds of things. It's just gorgeous. The Hyannis Port was now on the world map, and as our past town leaders have said, Cape Cod could go back to the way it used to be. Well, it never ever happened. We were not only the site of the summer White House, we were now on the global map, and people started to come here all times of year, not just for a vacation, but to really go see and try to understand the Kennedy mystique. So I think the young president understood how much Cape Cod was changing. We went through a rapid, unplanned growth spurt, starting with his really early candidacy, and then it just never really abated until the late 1980s. However, one thing that let me see, I love this quote, so I just want to read this to you. This is the quote from the town select board chair in our 1960 annual reports. Hyannis Port, as the selected site of the summer White House, has become internationally known. Last summer, thousands of people visited Hyannis Port to see the home of the young presidential candidate, causing traffic congestion and greatly disturbing the quiet tranquility of that little village. We fear that last year's problems will be insignificant when compared to what will happen this summer when the president and his family are in the port. And he was right. He actually went on, interestingly, to Victor Adams was his name. He went on to praise the new president and criticize those who voted against him, saying skeptics, he called them skeptics who said a Catholic president would not protect and defend the Constitution. Now, I have to understand, Cape Cod did not carry the vote. We're pretty Republican here, and they didn't vote for Jack Kennedy then. But there was great hometown pride, and we were very excited to have a president living in our neighborhood. I think what President Kennedy did, understanding that the growth pressures and the change that was being brought on this place that he loved, he would just love to come here, didn't want to make political speeches, he wanted to sail, he wanted to be with family, he just wanted to recharge and reconnect and be filled with the equilibrium that being on the ocean will give you. So what he did for us, so it's a pretty significant thing, and that was to create the Cape Cod National Seashore. So if you know Cape Cod, this is a picture of Cape Cod from space, the whole outer arm of Cape Cod. There's a few spots that it kind of takes a wiggle here, but 43,000 acres of outer Cape Cod are now called the Cape Cod National Seashore. And he did that for us. And we today cannot imagine Cape Cod without that great beach being so preserved in its natural state. It's called the Cape Cod model of national parks because it wasn't taken from raw land or unoccupied land. I mean, there were villages that have been here since, well, for 10,000 years with the Wampanoag tribe, but also the Pilgrims who landed over 400 years ago. So it had been populated, but over that was laid this Cape Cod model of a national park that has really created an amazing sense of place, and it has enhanced the value of all of our properties just because it exists, even if we're in other parts of Cape Cod. So that, I think, has been his greatest legacy for Cape Cod. But I will have to tell you, as someone in my closing comments, as someone who works at the museum now, it's a very emotional place to be. People come from all over the world, And almost everyone has a story or some reason that they're there, not just because, oh, I happened to come by and there's a museum. They have, I was in the Peace Corps, or my dad worked for NASA, or my father was in the Navy, or there's just some kind of connection. And part of it also goes back to how inspired they were by President Kennedy and how he set lofty goals for people and gave inspiration and hope in a time that was kind of dicey. I mean, we were really in a very severe Cold War conflict with Russia, and it could have gone badly. We could have gone into a nuclear war. So people look at that juxtaposition of the time then and think about the times we're in now. But they leave with a better understanding and understanding how Cape Cod was a place that really supported this world leader and his family and how he supported us. So those are my comments. I hope I haven't gone too long, and I'm sure you will. Hopefully you have some questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
You haven't gone too long at all, Wendy. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. If anyone has any questions for Wendy, please throw those in the Q&A and we'll start taking them. I have to say, one of my first things that I noticed, like right out the top, Wendy, was when you showed that picture of all the kids and no one is smiling except for him. I was like, you were just being charming and media ready from the get-go, weren't you? Like you were ready to be president at the gate.
Well, you know what's interesting? I learned recently, Ambassador Joe Kennedy made sure every single one of his kids had a movie camera. Now, this is like in the 40s. And so that they all got used to being around a camera, like kids are today with iPhones. They see an iPhone and they stop and they pose, right? So yeah, they were all encouraged to take pictures of each other, take movies of each other, so that they felt very comfortable with the camera. But I think he loved life. He was kind of I don't want to say a troublemaker, but he loved to be in the middle of it all and having a good time. All the Kennedys like to have a good time.
So we kind of talked about this before we opened the Zoom for our patrons, but outside of President Kennedy and Jackie, I think I know what the answer is. Which of the Kennedy family do you find the second most interesting to research and learn about?
Well, I'm about to dive in more to learn about Eunice, because she was extremely smart and she was very, very ambitious. Like I said, she in another day and age would have run for president. And they were all extremely intelligent, but she had a drive about her. She was very competitive, even sailing. Some great sailing stories about her. I've learned more about Bobby. He was he was really low in the birth order, and he really had to struggle to get the attention of his father and his mother, and he figured out how to do it though. He was really motivated. And you think about, he went from being his brother's campaign manager to attorney general. Then after his brother's been killed, he goes in and serves New York as senator, and then decides to take his own run for the presidency. And that doesn't go well either. There's another murder in the family. It's just amazing. And I've gotten to know some of Bobby Kennedy's kids, his children, who are amazing. And they're all doing important things. None of them are really running for, well, some of them are running for office, but the next generation down has found a way to give back through public service by being in nonprofits, either ones that were started by their parents or ones that they created. But there's about 105 people now in the immediate family, so there's a lot to learn.
You're getting so many compliments on your presentation, so I want to make sure I pass those along. But a couple guest questions. First one is, where on the map that we're currently looking at is Hyannis Port?
It's right about here.
All righty.
And this is about 7 miles from this side to this side. And this is about 45 minutes out to here. This is Chatham. And it's about an hour up to Provincetown, where the Pilgrims first landed.
Was Rose active in the Cape Cod community?
Very. She was the daughter of the mayor of Boston, Honey Fitz, and she grew up in a political family, so she was always inviting people to tea. She was always on the campaign trail. She was very open and inviting. There's a fun story about Rose where, there was I guess a tour bus driving around Hyannis Port trying to find the houses, and the driver stopped and saw this lady walking down the road and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, do you know where the Kennedy compound is?" And she said, "Well, yes, I do." She got on the bus. She said, "I'll take you there." Drove them down that circular driveway, got everybody out, invited them into the house and said, this is the main house. Come on in, take a look around. And they were just a gaga, but she loved seeing the reaction of people in her house, so she was quite the character, that one too.
Oh gosh, to be on that tour bus, that would have been
Can
just
you
the
imagine?
biggest.
Like, oh yeah, it's Rose Kennedy. Took us into
Um,
her house. That didn't happen all the time, though.
uh, was Ted the youngest of the siblings?
Yes, he was born in 1932 and ironically lived longer than a lot of his siblings. He was 47 years in the US Senate. They called him the Lion of the Senate. And he was, that none of them were perfect people. They had very human lives, but he got some amazing work done in the Senate and worked across the aisle, was a coalition builder. We went to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the US Senate that was built after his death. And at that dedication was Senator John McCain, Senator Trent Lott, a lot of people, a lot of very famous Republicans that were there to honor their friend Ted Kennedy.
Where on this map is Boston?
Okay, it's way up there. So this is Plymouth. This is the Pilgrims left here and went to Plymouth. And then it's about another 45 minutes north in the direction of the red dot. This is Providence, Rhode Island is over here. Newport, Rhode Island is here.
Thank you for the little geography lesson on top of all this. We're getting
Fun?
so much information.
Yeah.
So kind of a little since I'm a library, I have to shameless plug. I know a couple books popped on, mostly about the ones you shared about Jackie and her campaign to create the museum in the White House. What books would you recommend our patrons check out or look to us for if they wanted to learn more about JFK or about the Kennedys at Cape Cod?
Do you know there's been over 40,000 books written about the Kennedys?
Oh my gosh.
40,000. I think that's because they all sell. There's a really excellent book. The first, it's a two-part, two volumes. The first volume has been published. The second is about to come out. It's a Harvard history professor, Frederick Logevall, Logevall, Frederick Logevall. And his first volume is amazing. It's so readable, it's so rich, but he was doing all this deep research at the JFK Library. In some cases, they have slowly made older archives available, like this whole archive on Joseph P. Kennedy, the ambassador. But that is an amazing volume. It takes you up to 1956, 1917 to 1956, and he told me he's finished the second volume. And we've heard, I believe, that Netflix has picked it up to do a series similar to The Crown. But you got to read the book. It's a great read.
And for
it's called JFK. Oh gosh, I will email it to you. Is it in my office? No, it's JFK. Something about I can't remember.
What was the author's name one more time?
Frederick, Fredrik, Frederick Logevall, Logevall, Harvard history professor.
Hopefully that should be enough for our guests to find
you can find it.
Frederick Logevall Kennedy. And what I was going to say is if you look to our catalog, and we don't have it, don't forget that we can always see if we're able to get that through an interlibrary loan. I imagine something like this, either we would already have or we would easily be able to get through interlibrary loan. So don't hesitate to use the resources you have with your handy dandy library card. Couple more questions from our guests.
Sure.
I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the 60s, and Rose Kennedy used to attend the Catholic Church there from time to time. Do you know what connection she might have had to Chapel Hill?
Gosh, I don't. But Rose Kennedy wrote a book. She wrote an autobiography, Times to Remember. That would be a good one to check out. And sometimes you can find books, she published that, I think, in the 1980s. Check that out. Times to Remember. I don't, but she was extremely, think of the tragedy in this poor woman's life. And she lived to 104, but she had a very strong faith that totally sustained her. Yeah, she was an amazing person.
Was the book you mentioned, JFK Coming of Age in the American Century?
Yes, thank you. I knew it had the American Century in there.
Yep. Yes. So I guess I'm gonna put this as a type answer, so I think all of our guests can see it. It's JFK Coming of Age in the, oh gosh, it went away on me.
Coming of Age in the American Century,
1917 to 1956. And again, if we don't have it at the Schomburg Library, or I think there's maybe a couple people on here who aren't in the Schomburg Library, which is totally fine. Glad you came and learned something with us. Check out your libraries. They're a wonderful resource. Because of, I'm going to say one of these places names very incorrectly. So please correct me, Wendy. I'm sure you'll pick up on this. And I apologize to the guest who asked this. Because of the close proximity of Martha's Vineyard and Chappaquiddick?
Chappaquiddick.
Aha, I did it. Did the Kennedys sail or party there?
I'm sorry, what was it?
Did the Kennedys often sail or party at Martha's Vineyard or Chappaquiddick? So
Chappaquiddick is on the very, well, I'm getting myself backwards here. So this is the cliffs at Aquina. So Chappaquiddick is sort of this little tiny island off of Martha's Vineyard, and it's a beach community. So beach communities in the summertime are just ripe for parties. The sailing was primarily here in this body of water. It's very shallow. This Nantucket Sound is very shallow, which is why you need those shallow hulled boats. But a lot of sailboat races in this triangle here. And it's sort of on that way. It's like right about where that red dot is. So it's a natural spot. You could sail over and picnic if you wanted to.
All right, so I have a weird question for you.
Okay.
Please remember, what was his sister's name who you said would have run for president? Was it
Eunice?
Eunice. I wanted to say Eunice, but then my brain's like, no, it's Ethel. So Eunice. If let's say it's 2023, it's totally normal for a woman to run for president.
No.
If Eunice was running against JFK, who do you think would win?
I think Eunice would have given her brother a run for the money. He may have had a leg up on her though, because he was such a sick child. He spent a lot of time in bed and he did a lot of reading, right? And he naturally gravitated to books about other countries and how their governments worked. And then the father sent the sons, all the family, to other countries to meet with world leaders and said, don't take my word for it. Go out and experience the world. And JFK really, really did that quite deeply and intensely. Probably had the best foreign relations knowledge going into the presidency of anyone up until that time, maybe even after. And I don't know if Eunice had that same depth of knowledge, but boy, she was competitive. So who knows? Invite me back next year and I'll have a thing on Eunice.
Oh, perfect. This is also, since you said that, this is a great time to shamelessly plug a new library program series that we're starting in January. On the third Tuesday of the month, we'll be hosting a virtual lecture. The series is called Night with the Museum, and we will be hosting, with one small exception, March. Every other month will be a museum or cultural institution from outside of the state of Illinois. So we already have our first two up online because we've posted our winter schedule. So Our January lecture is going to be the Limburg Historic House in Minnesota, and our February one is going to be the Mob Museum from Las Vegas. So make sure you go sign up for those, and make sure you keep your eyes out for the third Thursday for our virtual series. It's a great opportunity to expose our patrons here at Schaumburg, and of course anyone else who has decided to join us tonight, to some amazing cultural institutions and knowledge bases from across our country. And as we are getting closer to 8, I want to make sure I'm respectful of not just your time, Wendy, but the time of all of our patrons who have signed on with us. I want to close out with one question. This is the question I warned you was coming,
Okay.
that I like to ask my patrons my speakers if I can. You obviously know a lot about this family and their life. And what is something from your studies and your learning and even meeting the Kennedys that you've taken away and is affects the way you live your everyday life, is kind of a guiding point in how you make choices? Or
Well, yes, thank you. That's probably for the last 30 years, one of my mantras has been lifted totally from a Kennedy quote, which I now understand Jackie wrote, but it's he said, every man can make a difference. I like to say everyone can make a difference and everyone should try. And that's pretty much how I've tried to live my life the last 30 years. Like, I might not be able to get it all done, but I should at least try. And I think I can make a difference. And I hope I have in a little bit of a way. Certainly nothing like a president of the United States, but it's just a great philosophy of life.
I love that. And I think that's a great note to end tonight on, and a great message for our guest tonight to take with them. Everyone on this call can make a difference, and everyone should try. So again, Wendy, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you to all the patrons who joined us as well, and some of our guests from maybe outside of Schaumburg. Wendy, I think you shared the link for this event as well in your area, so hopefully we have some friends from around you as well who joined us and had just as much fun as I know I did this evening. From myself at the Schaumburg Library, and I'm going to bargain that Wendy feels the same way. We wish you a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. Good night, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you.